The bus groaned its way into Ridgeline Valley just after dawn. Its headlights cut pale tunnels through mountain fog that clung to the pines like smoke from a fire long gone cold. The engine rattled over potholes and frost heaves, shaking the few passengers in their seats, but only one of them sat perfectly still. Jessamine Calder sat near the back shoulders squared out of habit, spine straight as a rifle barrel. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers loose but ready, the way a person holds themselves when they have spent years expecting the world to explode without warning. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wilderness sliding past the window. Pine forests thick enough to swallow daylight. Granite ridges cutting the sky like broken teeth. A landscape so vast and indifferent, it made a person feel either free or terribly small. At her feet lay Ghost. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, lean and scarred, his muzzle streaked with silver that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His ears twitched with every jolt of the bus, tracking sounds the other passengers couldn't hear. When the brakes hissed too sharply or the engine backfired against a grade, Ghost would lift his head and press his shoulder against Jess's shin. Not out of fear, out of duty. He had been doing it for years. He had been doing it since the desert. Jess placed her hand on Ghost's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The warmth traveled up through her palm and loosened something knotted deep inside her chest. 3 years of therapy hadn't erased the sandstorms, the tunnels, the explosions, the screams that lived behind her eyelids every time she closed them too long. Treatment had only taught her how to carry those ghosts without collapsing under their weight. Montana, in all its cold honesty, felt like the last place on earth where she might breathe without flinching at the echo of war. When the bus hissed to a stop on the tiny main street of Ridgeline, Jess stepped down with Ghost pressed close to her leg. Morning light washed over a scatter of wooden storefronts, a gas station with a peeling roof, and a small diner where a handful of locals nursed their first coffee of the day. The valley cradled the town on all sides. Towering pines, jagged cliffs, a sky so wide it felt like a cathedral built for no one in particular, a place big enough to hold a wounded woman. Ghost sniffed the cold air, tail low, but alert, scanning the quiet street with the same disciplined caution he had learned in Helmand province. His eyes moved in precise sweeps left to right, near to far, exactly the way he had been trained to clear a perimeter before his handler stepped forward. Jess placed a hand on his neck. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "New start, remember." But the town did not feel like a new start. The town stared back at her with a tight, uneasy curiosity that Jess recognized instantly. A man in a canvas apron paused mid-sweep outside the feed store, his broom frozen against the wooden planks, eyes narrowing as he tracked Jess across the street. Two older women at the diner window leaned toward each other, whispering with the kind of urgency that pretended to be casual, but fooled no one. A younger man by the gas pumps, straightened hands settling on his hips, looking Jess up and down like he couldn't decide whether he was seeing a neighbor or a problem. Jess felt the shift in the air, the weight of judgment, the silence that wasn't silence at all, but 100 small assessments being made at once. She had felt it before. In airports, in grocery stores, in waiting rooms where people glanced at the service vest on her dog and then looked at her with that particular expression. The one that said something is off about that one. The one that said the war broke her. She had hoped a small town might be different. She was wrong. Jess lifted her duffel bag over one shoulder and crossed the street toward the general supply store. Ghost moved closer, his flank brushing against her in a quiet gesture of support. The dog had a way of reading the tension in her body before she recognized it herself. When her jaw tightened, Ghost leaned harder into her stride. When her breathing shallowed, he slowed his pace until she matched it. He had saved her life once, dragging her by the collar of her uniform through 30 feet of rubble after the blast that killed half her unit. He had refused to leave her, even when he was bleeding from shrapnel buried in his right foreleg, even when the dust was so thick neither of them could see. In return, Jess had fought through 8 months of paperwork, 3 appeals, and 1 congressional inquiry to adopt him after her discharge. They were the last 2 survivors of their unit. There was no world in which one walked away without the other. A bell jingled as Jess pushed open the door of the supply store. The smell hit her first. Cedar and dust and old newspaper ink. The kind of smell that belonged to a place where time moved slowly and strangers moved even slower. Behind the counter stood a tall man with tired eyes and a jaw set a little too firmly for someone selling nails and rope. His hair was iron gray, cropped short in a way that suggested discipline rather than fashion. A faded patch on his jacket read, Sutter's Supply, and beneath it, almost hidden by a fold of fabric, Jess noticed a small pin, a bronze star. Harlan Sutter studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Help you?" he asked. Not unkind, but not welcoming either. "I'm looking for Iron Ridge," Jess said. "Bought a parcel up there. Need to know which road splits toward it." Harlan gave a slow blink. Recognition moved behind his eyes like a fish turning beneath still water. "You're the one who bought the old Haggerty property." "That's right." He let out a small grunt, the kind that carried more meaning than a paragraph. "Didn't think anyone would touch that land again. Not after what happened to the families before you." "I like quiet," Jess said. "You'll get quiet," Harlan muttered. "You'll also get storms that will peel the roof off anything you build. Wind up there runs 60, 70 miles an hour on a calm day. Hope you're stable enough for it." The hesitation before the word stable was deliberate. Jess heard what he really meant. She had been hearing it for 3 years. Hope you're not too broken. Hope whatever happened over there stays over there. Ghost took a single step forward, placing himself slightly ahead of Jess. Not aggressive, just present. His eyes locked on Harlan with steady patience. Harlan stiffened. Jess exhaled slowly. "Just need the directions." Harlan pointed toward a faded map tacked to the wall beside a rack of fishing lures. His hand stayed close to his body, careful not to reach past Ghost. Jess studied the map in silence, memorizing every curve of the dirt road that wound up through pine forest toward the ridge. She traced the route with her fingertip, noting the elevation gain, the switchbacks, the places where the road narrowed to a single lane. As she turned to leave, Harlan called after her. "Hey, look." His voice was quieter now. Something shifted in it. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition that went deeper than curiosity. "Folks talk in a town this size. Word gets around fast. They say you're military. That true?" "Was," Jess said without turning. Harlan nodded once, but his gaze dipped toward Ghost's service vest and the scars that traced the dog's right foreleg. "The Ridge doesn't care about medals or service records," Harlan said. "It only cares whether you can take what it gives. Last thing this valley needs is someone unpredictable up there." The word landed harder than Harlan probably intended. Unpredictable. It was the polite version of broken, the sanitized version of dangerous. The word people used when they wanted to say they were afraid of you, but didn't want to sound cruel. Jess didn't answer. She walked out without looking back, Ghost falling into step beside her, like a shadow stitched to her boots. The morning air felt colder now, sharper. Ghost brushed against her leg again, a silent reassurance, the same gesture he gave her. After nightmares, after loud noises, after memories clawed their way back without warning. Jess knelt on the cracked sidewalk and pressed her forehead against Ghost's. His breath was warm against her chin. His eyes, deep brown and unwavering, held the only kind of trust she still believed in, the kind that had been earned in dust and blood and darkness. "It's just us, buddy," she whispered. "But that's enough. It's always been enough." She stood, straightened her pack, and looked toward the ridge rising in the distance above the tree line. A dark scar of rock and wind-stripped earth against the pale sky. Ridgeline Valley didn't want her here. It didn't trust her. It didn't believe in her. But Jess hadn't come to be believed in. She had come to disappear, to find a piece of ground where the noise inside her head might finally quiet down, to build something with her hands that the past couldn't reach. She didn't know yet that one day soon the same neighbors who whispered about her would be pounding on her door begging her and Ghost to save their lives. "Come on, boy," she said softly. And together they started the long walk toward the land no one wanted. The land where a storm and a miracle were waiting for them both. The dirt road to Iron Ridge wound through miles of pine forest so thick it swallowed sound and daylight within the first 100 yards. Jess carried her duffel over one shoulder, boots sinking into patches of old snow that spring hadn't finished clearing. The air smelled like wet pine needles and cold stone. Ghost trotted beside her head-high ears, tuned to every crackle and rustle in the underbrush. Squirrels, wind through dead branches, the distant crack of a tree limb surrendering to its own weight. Each sound registered in the dog's posture, a slight turn of the ear, a brief pause in stride before being filed away as harmless. His presence alone kept Jess grounded. Each soft footfall beside her was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this exile she had chosen. After nearly an hour, the trees thinned, the road steepened, and then the ridge appeared. Iron Ridge rose from the forest like a scar carved into the mountain's face. Bare, wind-beaten, stripped of everything soft. Only stubborn grass survived up there, clinging to cracks between rocks that had refused to erode for 10,000 years. The soil was thin and mean, the kind that broke plows and promised nothing. At the base of the ridge, a collapsed cabin lay with its roof caved inward as if crushed by a giant fist. Gray wood splintered at the edges, bleached by decades of sun and punished by decades of wind. A second structure farther up the slope had been torn clean in half. Its beams jutted outward like broken ribs, exposing a dark interior filled with snow and animal droppings. The third structure near the ridge's crest was little more than a stone foundation smothered under drifts. 3 homes, 3 families, 3 failures. Jess stopped walking. Ghost stopped beside her, tail lowered. "So this is it," Jess murmured. "Our new home." The wind answered first, a sharp whistle that slid down the ridge and sliced through her jacket like it wasn't there. Ghost growled softly as a gust tumbled loose snow across their boots. The land felt colder here, meaner, as if it were testing her the moment she set foot on it. Jess walked toward the remains of the first cabin and ran her fingertips across the shattered wood. She pictured the family who had lived here. The husband who probably built it with his own hands, proud and certain. The wife who hung curtains in the windows. The children who played on this porch before the mountain took everything back. She didn't need anyone to tell her why the land had been abandoned. The evidence was scattered in every direction. Shattered beams, torn roofing, foundation cracks that spoke of forces no ordinary home could withstand. Iron Ridge didn't just break houses. It broke the people who tried to tame it. Ghost let out a small bark, drawing Jess's attention. The dog limped slightly, old scar tissue along his right foreleg tightening in the cold. Jess knelt beside him, rubbing warmth into the leg until Ghost relaxed and leaned his weight into her hands. "Easy, buddy," she whispered. "We'll make it work, I promise." They climbed higher. The wind grew stronger with every step, pushing against them like an invisible hand trying to shove them back down the mountain. But Jess leaned into it the way she had leaned into 100 things that tried to push her backward, and she kept climbing. The flat stretch of land she had purchased sat just below the ridge's crest. A wooden stake marked the property line, half buried under fresh frost. The view from here was staggering. Below them, Ridgeline Valley looked peaceful. A tiny scattering of lights and rooftops tucked between pine ridges, smoke curling from chimneys, roads threading through the landscape like gray ribbons. It looked like a postcard. But up here, the world was raw and indifferent. The wind never stopped. The cold never relented. The sky pressed down with a weight that made a person feel either very strong or very small. A place where a woman either built something smarter than the weather or didn't build anything at all. Jess swallowed hard. She knew what the locals said about this ridge, that it chewed through men tougher than her, that the land was cursed, that no veteran, no broken mind should be living up there alone. Ghost nudged her hand with his nose, grounding her. Jess let out a slow breath. Yeah, I hear you. She set down her duffel, unrolled a small notebook, and flipped through pages of sketches she had made during her years in the service. Temporary field shelters, curved blast deflectors, reinforced arch structures engineered to survive explosions, sandstorms, and rocket attacks. Designs she had once dismissed as too ugly for civilian life now pulsed with new possibility on this brutal ridge, where beauty was irrelevant and survival was everything. And then it happened. The wind ripped across the ridge, and a shelf of snow slid off a curved boulder just ahead of them. Jess watched it happen in slow motion, the angle of the curve, the way the snow broke apart without resistance, the clean, effortless shed of weight from a surface that refused to hold it. Something fired in the deepest part of her memory, not the bad memories, not the ones that woke her screaming at 3 in the morning, a different kind, a memory of shelter, of survival. She was back in Afghanistan, not the worst day, a different day, a day when incoming mortar fire had driven her squad into a curved metal Quonset hut near the base perimeter. Shrapnel had screamed across the compound, shredding tents and tearing through flat-roofed structures like paper. But the curved hut deflected everything. Metal fragments hit the surface and skimmed off like stones, skipping across water. The ground shook. Dust filled the air so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Ghost was barking somewhere in the chaos, pulling her deeper inside the shelter, and the curved metal held. When the attack ended, half the base was rubble. But the Quonset hut stood untouched, not because it was stronger than the other structures, because it was shaped differently. The curve didn't fight the force, it redirected it. Jess blinked. The memory released her gently. She looked at the boulder. She looked at the shattered cabins below. She looked at the wind tearing across the ridge with its endless, patient fury. A cabin with a normal roof didn't survive here because a normal roof was never designed for this. Flat roofs collected snow until the weight crushed them. Peaked roofs caught wind like sails until the gusts ripped them apart. Every family that had tried to build on Iron Ridge had built the same way people built everywhere else. And every one of them had lost. But something curved, something arched, something that would shed the snow and split the wind and let the mountain's fury slide off without resistance. Ghost. Jess whispered, her eyes widening. I know what we're going to build. Ghost tilted his head ears high, watching her with alert patience. An arch cabin, Jess said. A steel shell over a home. We're not going to fight the weather. We're going to outsmart it. For the first time since arriving in Ridgeline Valley, something warm flickered behind Jess's ribs. Not confidence exactly, something quieter, something that had been missing for so long she had almost forgotten its name. Purpose. She imagined it right there on the ridge, 40 feet long, wide enough to cover a full cabin, strong enough to laugh at the storms that had destroyed everything else. A place that couldn't be torn down, couldn't be crushed, couldn't be erased. A place where the ghosts couldn't reach her. And then she heard voices. They traveled up the ridge on the wind broken and scattered at first, then clearer as the group climbed higher. Jess turned to see 4 townspeople watching her from the lower trail. Bowen Pryor stood in front. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, deep-chested, with hands built for swinging axes and settling arguments. His face was weathered past his years, and his mouth was set in the kind of permanent frown that came not from anger, but from something heavier, something he carried everywhere he went. His arms were crossed, his expression mixed amusement with something sharper. Looks like you found the graveyard, Bowen called up. His voice carried easily on the wind. 3 families tried that land, lost roofs, lost money, nearly lost their lives. County had to airlift the last ones out. Jess didn't answer. Bowen smirked. But hey, we heard you're some kind of military engineer. Maybe you'll last longer than a month. The woman behind him whispered something. The group snickered. Ghost stepped forward, growling low, his stance shifting from relaxed to protective in the space of a single breath. His shoulders squared, his head dropped, his eyes locked on Bowen with an intensity that made the big man take half a step backward. "Control your dog, soldier," Bowen said. The word soldier came out wrong, not like respect, like a diagnosis. "We don't need another unstable veteran up here." Jess's jaw tightened. Heat rose behind her eyes, the familiar buzz of adrenaline, the tightness in her chest. Ghost sensed it instantly. He turned away from Bowen and laid his chin on Jess's forearm, grounding her with warmth instead of pressure. A different technique. The one he used when the trigger was anger rather than fear. Jess forced herself still. "We're just passing through." Bowen laughed. "Hope so. Nobody wants you living up here. Ridge will finish you off anyway." The group turned and started back down the trail, still muttering. She watched them go. And that was when the thing she overheard changed everything. It happened later that afternoon down in the valley. Jess had come back to town for water and supplies. She was outside the supply store loading jugs into her pack when voices drifted through the open side window of Sutter's Supply. Harlan Sutter's voice, first low and gravelly. "Bowen's got no right running her off that ridge. It's her land. She paid for it." Then Truett Ogden, the old postmaster, his voice thin and careful. "You know why he's like that, Harlan. You know what happened with Curtis." A silence. The kind that fills a room when a name carries too much weight. Harlan spoke again, quieter now. "That was years ago." "Doesn't matter," Truett said. "Bowen sees every veteran and sees Curtis all over again. Can't help it. After what Curtis did to that barn, after he nearly killed little Birdie in the fire, after he just vanished into nothing. Bowen's never been right since." Jess stood motionless outside the window, her hand frozen on the strap of her pack. Curtis, Bowen's younger brother. A veteran who came home carrying the same invisible wounds Jess carried. A man whose demons won. "Nobody knows if Curtis is alive or dead," Truett continued. "Bowen's been carrying that for 5 years. Every time he sees someone like her, someone with that look in their eyes, that dog, that silence, he sees Curtis standing in the doorway of that burning barn." Harlan let out a long breath. "That's not her fault." "No," Truett agreed. "But grief doesn't care about fault." Jess pulled her hand from the window frame and stepped away without making a sound. Ghost stood beside her, reading the shift in her breathing. She didn't feel angry anymore. Not at Bowen, not at the whispers or the stares or the word unstable thrown at her like a stone. She felt recognition, because she knew what Curtis felt. She knew the burning barn. She knew the moment when the noise inside your head gets so loud you can't tell what's real and what's memory. She knew the urge to disappear. The only difference between her and Curtis was 70 pounds of loyal dog who refused to let her vanish. Jess looked down at Ghost. He looked back with those steady brown eyes, unblinking, unwavering. "You saved me," she whispered. "Curtis didn't have you." Ghost's tail gave one slow wag as if he understood exactly what she meant. Jess straightened her pack and turned back toward the ridge trail. Somewhere down the valley, Bowen Pryor was sitting in his farmhouse hating every veteran who reminded him of the brother he couldn't save. And somewhere on Iron Ridge, a woman he wanted gone was about to prove him wrong about everything. Jess looked once more at the broken foundations scattered across the slope, then at the curved boulder where the snow had slid away so cleanly. She felt the notebook in her pack heavy with sketches of arches and angles and survival. If they couldn't build something strong enough, she murmured to the wind. Then I will. Ghost barked once, sharp and certain. The ridge wasn't cursed. It was simply waiting for someone stubborn enough, smart enough, and broken enough to understand it. Jess gathered her bag, tightened the straps, and faced the land that everyone else feared. The wind hit her full in the chest. She leaned into it. "Come on, boy," she said. "Time to build something that can't be torn down." And with that, she and Ghost walked deeper into the wind together. Two survivors heading toward a piece of mountain that the whole valley had given up on, unaware that this brutal stretch of rock and sky would one day become the only safe place left in Ridgeline Valley. The next morning, Jess stood at the base of Iron Ridge with her notebook under one arm and a simmering determination in her chest. The sky was a pale summer blue, wide and clean, the kind that made promises Montana had no intention of keeping once winter arrived. Ghost sniffed every patch of ground, ears twitching at distant sounds only he could hear. Jess flipped open the notebook and studied the rough sketches she had made the night before by lantern light. Curved ribs, reinforced steel, a shell that wrapped around a cabin the way armor wrapped around a soldier's chest. She didn't know what the townspeople thought they saw in her. Lost cause, broken mind, unstable veteran. But the truth was far simpler. She had survived years of things meant to kill her. And so would her home. She walked Ghost down the ridge trail into town, heading straight for Sutter's Supply. The bell jingled and heads turned sharply. A few customers froze, staring at Ghost first, and then Jess. Someone muttered under their breath. Another eased aside as if making room for something unpredictable. Jess kept her tone level. "Morning." Harlan Sutter cleared his throat behind the counter. "Back already?" "I need steel panels, the curved kind. Also anchor bolts, concrete mix, and a set of bending tools." Harlan blinked. "Curved steel. What for?" "Building a shelter." "A shelter," Harlan repeated flatly. "Up on Iron Ridge. That ridge eats shelters. This one will be different." A customer behind Jess snorted. "Is that what the last 3 families said?" Another chuckled. "Maybe she's building a bunker. That's what vets do when they've seen too much." The laughter was low, but it hit Jess like a slap. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, resonating too closely with a frequency she remembered from another life. Static radios, warning alarms, the hum before the blast. Ghost stepped forward until his shoulder touched Jess's knee, anchoring her to the present with the warmth of his body. Harlan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of shelter are we talking about?" Jess opened her notebook and laid it on the counter. "An arch cabin, steel shell. It deflects wind and sheds snow load instead of holding it." Harlan stared at the sketches in silence, then looked up at Jess as if she had spoken in a language he almost recognized but couldn't quite translate. "You want to build a half-cylinder over a house?" "Exactly." Well, it's something." "Will you order the steel?" Harlan hesitated. "That's a lot of money, and a lot of work for one person. No offense meant, but folks around here think you should maybe take it slow. Ease back into things." A softer laugh came from behind her. "Yeah, wouldn't want her snapping and taking the ridge with her." More chuckles. Jess stood motionless, jaw tight, but she didn't respond. She had endured enough to know that words thrown by strangers carried less weight than the ones she whispered to herself in the dark. Ghost turned his head toward the laughter and let out one low growl. The people nearby stiffened and stepped back. Harlan raised his hands. "Easy now." Jess closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm. "If you won't order the steel, I'll find another way." Harlan frowned. "Look, it's not that." "It's fine," Jess said. "Thanks for your time." She walked out before the humiliation could settle any deeper. Ghost stayed at her side, giving one last measured look over his shoulder before the door shut behind them. Outside, Jess crouched beside Ghost and rubbed behind his ears. We don't need them, buddy. We've done more with less. Ghost nudged her palm in agreement. Jess didn't waste another minute. She headed toward the edge of town, toward the old mining road she had passed the day before. Locals had mentioned the mine shutting down years earlier, leaving behind piles of scrap metal nobody cared enough to haul away. The road was slick with patches of mud and loose gravel, but the sun glinted off something in the distance. Rusted corrugated panels stacked in crooked rows, old machinery carcasses, bent beams. Steel panels long enough to be reshaped into the curved ribs she needed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't pretty. But it was enough to start. Jess ran her hand along the edge of one panel. We can work with this. She tried lifting the first panel. The metal was heavier than she expected, and its edge caught her glove, slicing through fabric and into her palm. Pain flared bright and sudden. Blood seeped into the dirt. Ghost whined sharply, circling her. It's okay, Jess murmured, wrapping her hand with a strip of cloth from her pack. Just a scratch. It wasn't just a scratch, but she had stitched worse in the field without blinking. She looked around at the sheer amount of steel she would need to move. The distance to the ridge, the steep incline, the impossibility of it. The size of the task was overwhelming, ridiculous, impossible for one person to do alone, which was exactly why she had to do it. She hauled the first panel onto her shoulder, staggered under its weight, and took one step, then another. The metal pressed into bruises she didn't remember earning, but she kept going. Ghost trotted ahead, checking the path and waiting when Jess lagged behind. Slow and steady, Jess muttered. We've done worse marches. By the third trip up the ridge, her shoulders were trembling. By the fifth, she tasted iron and cold on her tongue. But something inside her pushed harder than any drill sergeant ever had. With every load, she saw the arch a little clearer in her mind. With every step, the mocking voices faded a little further behind her. And that night, as the sun bled out behind jagged peaks and a thin layer of frost crept over the panels she had dragged home, Jess stood on her land, sweating, bleeding, exhausted, and she saw something no one else could see, a future. Ghost sat beside her chest, rising and falling in fatigue, but eyes bright with loyalty that no amount of suffering could diminish. Jess placed a hand on his head. We'll show them, Ghost, she whispered. We'll show them all. The wind howled across Iron Ridge as if laughing at her, but Jess didn't flinch. For the first time since setting foot in Ridgeline Valley, she wasn't just surviving, she was building. But Iron Ridge had a way of testing every soul who dared claim it. By the second week, Jess's plan to haul scrap steel from the abandoned mine had become a grueling routine that blurred one day into the next. Each morning, frost clung to the ridge like a second skin. Jess woke before sunrise, stuffed protein bars into her pocket, checked Ghost's healing foreleg, and began the long trek down the trail. Every trip felt like walking through a doorway that led back into the hardest days of her past. Silent, demanding, unforgiving. The mine site set in a bowl of rock and shadow. Cole would search through rusted heaps, choose panels that were still intact, and heave them onto her shoulder one by one. She had to angle them just right, or the sharp edges would bite through gloves and skin. Even being careful wasn't enough. On the fourth day, she lifted a heavy curved section, and the metal slipped. It swung downward, carving a clean gash across the back of her hand. Blood splattered onto the ground, startling red against dry earth. Ghost barked sharply and stood rigid beside her tail, stiff with concern. Jess hissed through clenched teeth, examining the wound. It's all right, buddy, she muttered. She wrapped the bleeding hand with a strip of cloth, tied the knot with her teeth, and kept going. That was the kind of woman she had always been, patched up, stitched together, still moving. But the ridge didn't relent. On the seventh day, the wheels of a borrowed wagon cracked under the weight of too much steel. Jess spent nearly an hour kneeling in the dirt, trying to fix it with blistered fingers. A sudden gust knocked over two large sheets leaning against a fallen log. The crash boomed across the valley like a distant explosion. Instantly, Jess's muscles seized. Her breathing quickened. For a split second, she wasn't in Montana anymore. She was back in Helmand, dust whipping her eyes, alarms blaring, Ghost barking frantically as the walls came down. Ghost raced to her and laid his full weight across her lap, pinning her gently to the earth. The pressure of his body against hers was deliberate and practiced, a technique he had learned through hundreds of repetitions. Deep pressure therapy, the same method he used during the worst nights when the nightmares dragged her so deep that words couldn't reach her. But 70 pounds of warmth and loyalty could. Jess let her breath out in a shaky exhale. "Thanks," she murmured. "I'm back." When the wagon finally gave out for good, Jess refused to leave the metal behind. She dragged each heavy piece up the ridge by hand, gripping rough edges until her palms blistered through the bandages. Ghost helped as much as he could, gripping smaller sections with his teeth and tugging them up the trail, favoring his healing foreleg, but never stopping. Every time Ghost stumbled, Jess's heart clenched. "Easy, boy," she warned again and again. "Don't push yourself too hard." But Ghost was a working dog trained to endure. He didn't complain. He only looked up at Jess with those steady brown eyes, as if to say, "We're in this together." By the 9th day, the cuts on Jess's hands had reopened, staining her gloves a deep rusty color. At night, she sat inside her temporary tent with a lantern flickering, sewing up torn skin with a needle and fishing line. Ghost lay with his head resting on her boot, watching every movement with quiet worry. "You remember when I was the one patching you up?" Jess said quietly. "Tight spaces, dirt everywhere. You were always calmer than half the soldiers I served with." Ghost let out a soft grunt as if acknowledging the memory. That night, a storm swept over the valley with no warning. Not a blizzard, just a sudden violent downpour mixed with sleet. Jess rushed outside to cover the steel panels before they froze together. At one point, she slipped on wet ground, the world tilting, as the edge of a panel came crashing toward her. Ghost lunged forward, barking loudly enough to jolt Jess back to her senses. She threw herself sideways. The panel slammed into the ground, inches from her leg. "That could have crushed me," Jess muttered, sitting breathless in the mud. Ghost nudged her chest insistently, his nose cold and wet against her collarbone. "You're right," she whispered, her voice tight. "I need to be more careful." But careful wasn't enough when the land itself seemed determined to break her. On the 15th trip up the ridge, a storm cloud settled low, covering everything in thick gray haze. The world shrank to a blur of rain and rock. Jess pushed against the wind, carrying a sheet of steel almost as tall as she was. The gust shoved her sideways. Her boots skidded on loose gravel. She went down hard. The steel panel landed across her shoulders, knocking the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her back like a bolt of electricity. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't breathe. The weight pressed her into the earth, and for one heartbeat, the earth became sand, and the steel became concrete, and the sky became the ceiling of a collapsing building in Helmand. Where she had watched two friends die before, Ghost dragged her out by her collar. Ghost barked frantically. He circled her, pawing at the edge of the panel, trying to wedge his body underneath it, the same way he had wedged himself into the rubble overseas. The same desperate, determined effort. The same refusal to leave her. Jess forced her muscles to respond. Inch by inch, she rolled to the side, letting the weight slide off into the dirt. Her breath came fast and ragged. Ghost placed his head against her cheek, whining softly, his whole body trembling with the effort of holding himself back from panic. "I'm fine," Jess lied, feeling heat radiating from the strain in her ribs. "We're okay." She lay in the dirt for a long time. The sky was gray above her. Ghost's breath was warm against her face. And for the first time since she began this project, Jess felt the full weight of what she was attempting settle onto her chest alongside the pain. She was one woman, alone on a ridge that had defeated 3 families, building something the whole town said was impossible. carrying steel with the hands that couldn't stop shaking, driven by a mind that couldn't stop remembering. And the tears came. Not the kind she could blink away, not the kind she could swallow with a clenched jaw and a deep breath. The real kind. The kind that had been building behind a dam she had constructed from sheer stubbornness and military discipline for 3 years. She cried in the dirt on Iron Ridge with her arms around her dog, and Ghost held perfectly still, letting her bury her face in his fur, letting the sound of her grief disappear into his warmth. When it was over, she felt hollowed out, but lighter, as if something that had been pressing against the inside of her skull for years had finally found a crack to escape through. She wiped her face with a torn glove and looked at Ghost. He looked back at her with an expression that was neither pity nor concern. It was patience, the infinite, unshakable patience of a creature who had decided long ago that wherever this woman went, he would follow, and whatever she carried, he would help her carry until one of them could no longer walk. "Okay," Jess whispered. "Okay, let's keep going." She stood up, picked up the steel panel, and climbed. By the end of the second week, she had hauled enough steel to begin shaping the ribs of the arch lining them in the dirt, like the bones of a great metal beast waiting to rise. One evening, as the sun dipped low, coloring the sky in bruised violet, Jess stumbled into camp and dropped to her knees from sheer fatigue. Ghost immediately circled behind her, pressing his chest against her back to keep her upright. She closed her eyes. The cold stung her cheeks. Her breath fogged slowly in front of her. "Just need a minute," she whispered. But a minute turned into stillness. Stillness turned into darkness. And then nothing. Ghost barked, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the quiet. He nudged Jess once, twice harder each time. Then he turned and ran down the trail, barking relentlessly into the dusk. Footsteps pounded up moments later. "Hello, is someone up here?" Ghost led the voice back to Jess. A woman appeared through the fading light, moving quickly, her face lined with alarm. She was lean and weathered, mid-50s, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen their share of hard days. It was Doc Tierney's wife, Margaret, who lived in the nearest cabin below the ridge. She had heard Ghost's barking and followed the sound. She knelt beside Jess, checking her pulse, touching her forehead. "You're dehydrated," she said firmly, "and exhausted. You can't keep doing this alone." Jess tried to speak, but the words tangled. Margaret wrapped a blanket around Jess's shoulders. "You're going to get yourself killed on that ridge." Jess managed a faint smile. "Not with Ghost around." Margaret looked at the dog. Ghost stood beside them both, trembling, but watchful, his loyalty so fierce it was almost terrifying. "He knew something was wrong," Margaret said softly. "He came straight down the hill." Jess swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the devotion on both sides of her. One human, one canine, both refusing to let her fall. Together they returned to camp, and as Jess lay beneath her blankets that night, muscles aching, hands bandaged, Ghost curled close to keep her warm, a realization settled deep in her chest. This ridge wasn't just testing her, it was daring her, and she intended to win. The next morning, the sky glowed, a cold silver warning of winter still months away, but already gathering its strength beyond the peaks. Jess stepped out of her tent, muscles stiff but mind sharp. Ghost stretched beside her, shaking off the night chill before trotting toward the neatly stacked steel ribs she had dragged up one brutal trip at a time. Today was the day the arch would begin to take shape. Jess knelt beside Ghost, rubbing behind his ear. "Ready to build something crazy?" Ghost barked, once tail thumping. It was all the encouragement she needed. She spent the morning marking drill points and aligning anchor bolts. Every movement hurt. Her hands were wrapped in layers of cloth and tape. Her ribs still ached from where the steel panel had slammed her days earlier. But pain meant she was still going, still fighting. She set the first steel rib into place, its curved shape catching the pale light. Ghost watched intently, ears tall, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Jess tightened the bolts one at a time, checking and rechecking the alignment. When the first rib stood solidly upright, she stepped back and exhaled. It stood like the spine of something ancient and unbreakable. Ghost trotted underneath the arch rib, sniffing it with what looked remarkably like pride. "We're getting there," Jess whispered. By noon, a handful of townspeople appeared on the trail, drawn not by curiosity but by doubt. Bowen Pryor led the group, boots crunching in the gravel, arms crossed, mouth already twisted into a smirk. "Well, look at that," Bowen called out. "Thought you were building a house, not a whale skeleton." Laughter rolled through the group. Jess didn't look up. "It's an arch frame." Bowen snorted. "Looks like something that'll collapse as soon as the wind sneezes." Ghost stood stiffly beside Jess, fur rising along his spine. Bowen took a few more steps up the ridge, studying the rib. "Tell me something, soldier. You planning to hide under that thing when the storms come? You think metal's going to save you from this ridge?" Jess tightened, a bolt jaw steady. "It's not meant to hide. It's meant to outlast." "Outlast?" Bowen squinted. "Nothing outlasts Iron Ridge. Ask the 3 families before you. Oh, wait, you can't. They left after losing everything." Jess straightened. "All their roofs were flat or peaked. Mine won't hold snow. It'll shed it. There's a difference." Bowen raised an eyebrow. "And you learned that where in the war?" The way he said it made something bitter twist in Jess's chest. Images flashed unbidden. Dust storms swallowing bases whole. Curved shelters standing firm while everything around them shook apart. "Yes," Jess said evenly. "In the war, some things built for survival don't need to be pretty, just strong." Bowen let out a loud laugh. "Well, at least you know it's not pretty." Ghost growled, stepping between Jess and the group. Bowen backed up quickly. "Control your dog," he barked. Jess placed a hand on Ghost's collar. "He senses intention." Harlan Sutter had joined the group, but stayed behind Bowen, his expression unreadable. He studied the steel rib in silence, his eyes tracing the curve from anchor bolt to apex with a focus that separated him from the others. "Let her work," Harlan finally said. "It's her land." Bowen scoffed but didn't argue. The group dispersed, muttering as they went back down the trail. When they were gone, Jess knelt beside Ghost. "Good boy, but you can't bite the neighbors, no matter how much they deserve it." Ghost huffed as if deeply disappointed by the rule, then leaned into her side. Jess returned to work, the interruption fueling her determination rather than draining it. She lifted the second rib, braced it against the wind, and hammered anchor bolts into the ground until the vibrations numbed her arms. Hours passed. The structure began to take shape. A line of steel ribs arching upward like the beginnings of a cathedral. By late afternoon, Jess climbed a ladder to secure the top joint of the third rib. As she hammered, the steel hummed with each strike, echoing through the empty land like a heartbeat. Wind ripped across the ridge, sharp and sudden, shoving the rib sideways. The ladder rocked. Jess's feet slipped. For one terrifying instant, she dangled by one hand, the ground swinging beneath her. Ghost barked sharply below, pacing his body, coiled with the urge to help, but unable to climb. Jess caught the rung with her other hand and steadied herself. Her breathing hitched. The echo of falling metal blurred into familiar nightmare. Collapsing rubble, ringing in her ears, dust so thick it had its own weight. She squeezed her eyes shut. Not again, not here. She gripped the ladder tighter, grounding herself with slow breaths. Ghost whined softly below, ears pinned back, sensing the memory trying to pull her under. "I'm okay," Jess whispered. "I'm okay, buddy." She hammered the joint into place with renewed focus, finishing minutes before the daylight faded completely. When she climbed down and viewed the rising structure from a distance, 3 ribs stood tall, their curves catching the dying light. Ghost stood at the center of the frame, his silhouette framed by steel and sky. "This is really happening," Jess murmured. She walked beneath the ribs. The air stilled inside the space, shielded slightly from the biting ridge wind. For the first time, she felt the promise of warmth, safety. something she hadn't dared hope for. A home. Ghost leaned against her tail, swaying slowly. Yeah, Jess whispered. We're building something that can't be torn down. Above them, the steel ribs hummed softly in the evening wind, as if the ridge itself were acknowledging her, not welcoming, but no longer denying her either. Weeks passed. The arch grew, 6 ribs, 8, 10, each one a small victory against the wind and the doubt and the exhaustion that clung to Jess's bones like frost. And then one morning, Harlan Sutter appeared on the ridge trail carrying a heavy canvas bag over one shoulder. Jess straightened from her work, surprised. Ghost lifted his head from where he lay in the shade of the arch, assessing Harlan with calm attention. Harlan set the bag down at the edge of the construction site without ceremony. Curved steel panels, he said. Quarter-inch gauge, already bent to spec. Ordered them 3 weeks ago from a supplier in Billings. Jess stared at him. I didn't ask you to order anything. No, Harlan agreed. You didn't. He looked at the arch for a long time. His eyes traced every rib, every bolt, every joint with a precision that spoke of experience. Not just a shopkeeper's eye, a soldier's eye. The eye of a man who had spent time in places where the difference between a sound structure and a collapsing one was the difference between living and dying. I was in the Gulf, Harlan said quietly. It was the first time he had mentioned it to her directly. 91. 4 months in the desert. Came back with sand in my lungs and noise in my head that took 15 years to quiet down. He turned to face Jess. When I saw your sketches that day in my store, I recognized what you were drawing. Not the specific design, the thinking behind it. The way a mind works when it's been trained to keep people alive under conditions that want to kill them. He paused. Bowen thinks you're building a bunker because you're broken. I think you're building the smartest structure this ridge has ever seen. Jess didn't know what to say. Gratitude felt too small a word for what moved through her chest. She managed a nod. Harlan picked up his empty bag and turned to leave. At the edge of the trail, he stopped. I told Bowen to his face. I said I've lived long enough to know the difference between a crazy person and a smart one. He looked over his shoulder. You're the smart one, colder. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Then he walked back down the ridge without waiting for a response. Ghost watched him go, then trotted to the canvas bag and sniffed the new steel panels inside. He looked back at Jess and wagged his tail once. Yeah, Jess said softly. I think we just found an ally. With Harlan's steel and her own salvage panels, the arch took its final shape. Jess began building the cabin inside the shell, framing walls, cutting boards, measuring twice, cutting once, checking the level 3 times. She built it the way she had been trained to build things in the service, not for beauty, for survival. Ghost watched from the center of the arch. Ears flicking as every hammer strike sent echoes bouncing between the steel ribs. The arch amplified the sound, but it didn't frighten him. He sat calmly, tail thumping in rhythm, as if approving each piece installed. By the end of the first month of construction, the outline of a cabin stood within the steel embrace. Small, sturdy, and shaped with the same determination that had carried Jess through every scar life had carved into her. But Ridgeline Valley wasn't impressed. As Jess hammered siding into place one afternoon, 3 figures appeared down the trail. Bowen Pryor, his brother-in-law Vince, and an older man Jess didn't recognize. Bowen cupped his hands around his mouth. Hey, you planning on living inside a tin can for the winter? Vince chimed in. Looks like a giant hamster wheel. The third man barked a laugh. Bet the first big storm folds it up like a lawn chair. Ghost stiffened beside Jess, placing himself between her and the ridge path, shoulders squared. Easy, Jess said softly. They're not worth it. But the truth was the comment stung. Every jab made her question whether she belonged here. Every laugh scraped against old wounds. She took a slow breath. Ghost gently placed his head against her thigh. The world steadied. The men left eventually, but their words lingered. As the sun dipped, Jess lit her first fire inside the cabin frame. The scent of pine sap and warm smoke drifted upward, mixing with the metallic cold of the arch. Ghost curled on the new wooden floor, paws tucked under him. The glow from the lantern cast long shadows across the ribs, creating a cathedral of steel and wood. Jess sat with her back against the half-built wall. For the first time since coming home from the war, she didn't feel like she was running from the past. She was building towards something. "We're doing all right, buddy," she whispered. Ghost's tail gave a soft thump, but the ridge demanded more. Day by day, the cabin grew. 2 rooms instead of 1. A small loft for storage, windows carefully cut to catch morning light. The porch sheltered under the arch gave the place a sense of comfort rather than siege. And then Jess began the work that would truly save lives, though she didn't know it yet. She started cutting firewood. Sunrise to sundown, she split logs until her shoulders throbbed, hauling them into the arch to protect them from moisture. Ghost carried branches in his mouth, dragging smaller pieces up the trail, even when his limp grew noticeable. By late autumn, the firewood walls were nearly complete. Massive barriers of neatly stacked logs lining both sides of the cabin, dry and ready, enough to burn for 3 full winters. Harlan visited and stared wide-eyed. "That's enough wood to last until the next decade." "That's the point," Jess said. Harlan shook his head slowly. "Storms hit harder up here. You're either crazy or a genius." Jess didn't answer, but the ridge did. Wind howled briefly, a warning. Snow blew across the sky in a thin early veil. Winter was coming, earlier than anyone expected, harsher than anyone imagined. And for Jess and Ghost, it would bring the first true test of everything they had built. 2 days after Harlan's visit, the temperature dropped so sharply, it felt as though the valley had stepped straight from autumn into the dead of January overnight. The sky turned a cold, bruised gray, heavy enough to make the air feel thick with weight. Jess woke before dawn to silence. Deep, eerie silence, broken only by Ghost's low, uneasy rumble from the foot of the bed. When Jess stepped outside the cabin and into the shelter of the arch, she understood why. A wall of clouds crept over the ridge like a living shadow, dragging the light out of the sky. Not drifting, rolling, devouring. It was the kind of formation soldiers learn to fear in deserts and mountains alike. A storm with its own heartbeat. "This is it," Jess murmured. Ghost stood beside her, tail stiff, ears locked forward. The air tasted metallic. Jess made her rounds quickly. She checked every anchor bolt on the arch, tapping each rib to feel its tension pushing on the cabin walls to ensure the structure didn't shift under pressure. Everything held. Everything was ready. But readiness didn't stop the chill crawling up her spine. By mid-morning, the wind began. Not playful gusts, a long rising roar that climbed the ridge with a predator's patience. It hit the arch first, slamming into the steel with a deep vibrating hum. Snow lifted from the ground in spirals, dancing like white ghosts around the cabin. Inside the arch, however, the difference was immediate. The steel shell deflected the gusts, splitting them and sending them sliding along the curve. The air stilled. "Just like it's supposed to work," Jess whispered. But Ghost wasn't convinced. The dog stood at the arch entrance, staring out at the horizon with unblinking intensity. By noon, the first flakes fell. Big, heavy, wet, turning the ridge into a blur of white. The wind whistled over the arch and snow clung briefly before sliding off in clean ribbons. Jess carried firewood inside the cabin and lit the stove. Ghost lay nearby, but his ears twitched with every distant thud of wind. As afternoon darkened into premature evening, the storm intensified. Snow hit the metal like handfuls of gravel. The sky turned to swirling white. No horizon, no ground, just the storm swallowing the world. Then came the sound that froze Jess in place. A low muffled creak, not from the arch, from inside her, deep in memory, a flash of heat behind her eyes, ghost barking over sandstorms, the sudden shift of weight before a blast. Jess gripped the table edge knuckles white and squeezed her eyes shut. Ghost leapt to her side, placing his front paws on her knee, pushing his face up toward hers with urgent warmth. "I'm here," Jess whispered hoarsely. "I'm here, not there. I'm here." She grabbed fistfuls of Ghost's fur, feeling the warmth, the steadiness, the realness of him. Slow breaths, slow return. Outside, the wind shrieked long and high, like metal tearing. Jess stood slowly. "All right, storm's trying to scare us. Let's show it we're not moving." Ghost barked once sharper this time, confidence returning. As night fell, the storm evolved from fierce to brutal. The cabin shook faintly, but the arch held firm. Snow piled on top of the shell, only long enough to be swept off by the wind's sharp edge. The design was doing exactly what Jess had hoped. Around midnight, she stepped outside into the arch's sheltered space. The wind thrashed just beyond the threshold, but inside the shell the air was calm. The ground was dry around the cabin, while the world outside was buried inch by inch. She walked to the entrance and looked out. What she saw made her step back. The valley below was nearly invisible. Snow spiraled in violent columns. Trees bent at impossible angles. Distant lights flickered and died across Ridgeline Valley. Power lines swayed and snapped. This wasn't just an early winter storm. It was the worst storm in 50 years, and it had arrived 12 hours ahead of every forecast. Ghost stood beside her fur, rippling in the wind, swirling outside the arch. But he didn't retreat. "Come on," Jess said, patting her side. "Nothing more we can do out here." Back inside, she added wood to the stove and checked the radio. Static on every channel. On the third attempt, a voice cut through. "Whiteout conditions. Roads closed. Stay indoors. Do not attempt travel. Wind speeds exceeding." The message cut out, swallowed by static. Jess sat back, staring at the radio. "What do you think, boy? Is this the start of something bigger?" Ghost rested his head on her knee, giving a quiet huff. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. The windows trembled. The arch groaned but stayed strong. And the cabin, small, warm, and stubborn, held its ground. Near dawn, a sudden boom echoed outside. Distant but unmistakable. Ghost snapped upright, ears sharp. Jess grabbed her coat and rushed to the arch entrance. A glow lit the valley below. A fire. Something large. Something important. But the storm swallowed the rest, forbidding her from knowing more until daylight. "Whatever that is," Jess whispered, chest tightening. "It's not good." She closed the cabin door, stoked the fire, and sat beside Ghost through the final hours of darkness. The storm had arrived. The valley wasn't ready. But Jess and Ghost were. Because everything they had built, everything the town mocked, was about to matter in ways no one could imagine. When dawn finally pushed through the storm's thinning edge, it revealed a landscape twisted beyond recognition. The storm had carved the valley into a white wasteland. Snowdrifts rose higher than pickup trucks. Roofs sagged. Trees leaned at unnatural angles, their branches splintered under the weight of the night. Jess stood at the entrance of the arch. The pale morning light caught on the steel above her. Inside the shell, the ground was dry. The air, though still cold, was calm. Her design had worked exactly as she hoped. But Ridgeline Valley had not been so lucky. The fire she had seen during the storm was still burning. Thick smoke curled upward from the town's storage barn, a massive building near the center of the valley. Half the roof had collapsed, exposing flames licking at the remaining structure. Ghost paced beside her, restless. Jess scanned the ridge trail, steep, buried, obscured. No safe way down until the winds calmed. For the moment, all she could do was watch. Hours passed. The fire eventually died, choked by snow, but the damage had already spread. Other roofs had caved in. Chimneys remained stubbornly upright against the devastation marking where homes used to stand. By midday, Ghost alerted first, a sharp bark followed by a tense stance. Someone was coming up the ridge. Footsteps crunched through knee-high snow, uneven and frantic. The figure appeared a moment later. A man stumbling, leaning heavily against a walking stick, frost clinging to his beard. Truett Ogden, the old postmaster. Jess hurried toward him. "Truett, you all right?" Truett collapsed into the archer's coverage chest, heaving. He looked 20 years older than the last time Jess had seen him. "It's bad, Jess," he gasped. "The whole valley, the roofs, the fire. People are stranded." Ghost lay down beside Truett's legs, offering warmth without being asked. Truett wiped melted snow from his face. "The general store roof gave out. The boarding house, too. Families are without heat. Bowen's place is half gone. Folks are using what little they have to stay warm, but the storm destroyed most of the firewood stacks." "Any casualties?" Jess asked. Truett shook his head. "No deaths yet, but frostbite, broken bones, and now the fire. The barn was full of emergency supplies. Everything's gone." Jess breathed deeply, the weight of it settling on her shoulders. Truett's eyes drifted toward the arch. "Your place. It held. It actually held." Jess nodded quietly. "That's what I built it for." Truett hesitated, then spoke softly. "Bowen sent me. He said he's sorry, and he's coming up here with others. They need help, Jess. They need shelter." Jess stiffened. Bowen, the man who mocked her at every turn, who told her the ridge would break her, who saw Curtis in her face every time he looked at her, now coming to ask for help. She looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back, calm, steady, loyal as ever. Jess sighed. "Anyone's welcome here." The wind picked up again as Truett limped to the arch entrance, waving to the figures now emerging through the drifting white. There were 6 at first. Bowen, his wife Nora, and their granddaughter Birdie among them. The child could barely walk. Bowen carried her inside. Her little hands were blue from cold. Behind them came more. Vince with his arm in a sling. The Jensen twins wrapped in blankets. Old Mrs. Laramie leaning heavily on her grandson. Jess stepped aside. "Get them inside the arch. Stay out of the wind." Bowen stopped in front of her chest, heaving eyes red from cold and smoke. "I was wrong," he said, voice cracking. "About everything." Jess nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was enough for now. The families gathered inside the arch, huddling close as the wind battered the metal shell. Ghost moved among them, checking each person, resting his chin in unfamiliar laps, letting children warm their frozen fingers in his fur. The shell amplified the storm outside, humming like a distant engine, but the air inside remained steady, shielded safe. Doc Tierney, who had climbed the ridge with the first group, began treating injuries with Emily the neighbor assisting. Frostbite, sprained ankles, a broken wrist, dozens shaking with cold. Jess took stock of the space. Dry ground, towering firewood stacks. The cabin snug inside its armor. Enough to hold, enough to last. But the storm wasn't done with Ridgeline Valley. As evening fell on the second night, the wind's voice changed. It no longer howled, it screamed. The snow drift outside the arch grew into white cliffs. The arch vibrated with deep metallic groans like a living creature bracing itself. Inside, lantern light flickered over fearful faces. Ghost moved from family to family, calming crying children, warming shivering legs. Then above the roar a sound broke through. Not the storm, not falling trees, not the groan of distant collapsing roofs pounding. Desperate, a rhythmic hammering of fists against steel. Each strike rang through the arch like a bell tolled underwater. Deep and shuddering, everyone went still. Ghost's head snapped up. His muscles went rigid. A low growl built in his chest. Jess was already on her feet. She grabbed her coat and moved toward the arch entrance. Ghost stayed glued to her side. When she reached the mouth of the arch, she pushed aside the heavy tarp she had hung to block drifting snow. What she saw struck her straight in the chest. A group of nearly 20 people crowded at the entrance, faces raw with cold, clothes shredded by wind, eyes wild with fear. Some carried small children wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. A few hobbled on injured legs. And at the front, barely recognizable beneath layers of frost, stood Bowen Pryor. He had gone back down. He had gathered more people. He had led them up the ridge through the worst of the storm. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. Mara clutched Birdie, whose tiny fingers were purple at the tips. A wave of exhaustion and humiliation broke across Bowen's features as he forced himself to meet Jess's eyes. "Jess," his voice shook. "Please, please let us in. Birdie can't feel her fingers." Behind him, Birdie whimpered softly, a sound so faint Jess almost didn't hear it over the storm. Ghost stepped forward and sniffed the air. His tail lowered. His growl faded into a soft whine. He understood. These weren't critics. These weren't doubters. These were people on the edge of survival. Jess's chest tightened. For one short, painful moment, the scene blurred. The huddled figures became silhouettes against dust instead of snow. The crying became different crying. The hands reaching toward her became different hands. Ghost placed his front paws on her hip, pushing upward, his nose finding the underside of her jaw. A different technique than pressing against her leg. The one he used when she was standing, and the memory tried to pull her down. Jess blinked hard. Montana returned. "Get inside," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. Relief washed across the group. Bowen staggered forward, whispering, "Thank you, God, thank you." Jess guided them in one by one, settling them onto blankets near the firewood walls. The arch held. The wind raged, but inside the air remained calm. As the new arrivals warmed up, Jess counted. 27 people total now. 27 lives inside a steel shell that the whole town had laughed at. Bowen stood alone near the entrance, staring at the arch ribs with disbelief. "I can't believe this thing is standing," he whispered. Jess looked around the space. It was built to stand. Hours later, Bowen approached her again. His face was etched with guilt. "There are more out there, Jess. People who couldn't climb with us. The Henrys, Luke Jenkins, maybe others." Jess looked toward the storm-choked ridge path. A wall of white consumed everything. Doc Tierney stepped forward. "It's too dangerous, Jess. You go out there, you might not come back." "I'm not leaving anyone behind," Jess said. Ghost barked, sharp, ready. Bowen shook his head. "Let me go instead. I owe those people. I owe you." "You won't make it," Jess said. Not harshly, factually. "Ghost and I have done this before. Search patterns, low visibility, hostile terrain." She tightened her coat-checked Ghost's harness and clipped a rope between them. She grabbed a lantern. Then she turned to the families, frightened, shivering. Every one of them watching the woman they had once doubted prepare to walk into a storm that had already destroyed half their world. Jess took one deep breath. Then she and Ghost stepped into the white void together. The wind swallowed them instantly. The snow closed behind them like a curtain. The arch disappeared. The lantern light became a dim orange smear, and then nothing. Ghost stayed on Jess's left side, guiding her with the pressure of his body. When the ground dropped, he tugged the rope left. When a drift rose too high, he veered right. His nose worked the air, searching for scent through the burn of sub-zero wind. After what felt like an hour, Ghost barked twice. A shape materialized. A dark smudge slumped against a half-buried pine. Mr. and Mrs. Henry, the elderly couple from Elm Street. She was conscious but dazed. His eyes fluttered open at Jess's touch. "Can you walk, see?" Jess shouted. "We'll try, Mrs." Henry stammered. Ghost steadied the old woman with his body as she rose. Jess roped them together and led them back toward the ridge step by agonizing step. When the arch emerged through the snowfall, Jess exhaled for the first time in 20 minutes. Inside, the families gasped as Jess brought the couple through the entrance. Nora rushed forward with blankets. Jess barely had time to breathe before Ghost barked again. "More out there," she said, and she went back. They found Luke Jenkins next. 17 years old, half buried beside an overturned snowmobile, his bad knee twisted at a terrible angle. He was awake, teeth chattering so violently Jess could hear them over the storm. "Hold on to me," Jess told him. She lifted him in her arms, staggering under his weight as the wind shoved them sideways. But halfway back it happened. The weight of the boy in her arms, the snow blinding her eyes, the sound of the wind, a high metallic shriek that sounded too much like something she had heard before. And suddenly, Luke Jenkins wasn't Luke Jenkins anymore. He was Corporal Reeves, 22 years old, bleeding from his neck, dying in her arms in a dust-choked corridor while Ghost barked and the walls came down around them. Jess froze, her legs locked, her arms tightened around the boy. Her breathing went shallow and fast, the rapid hyperventilation of her body caught between two realities. She could feel snow against her face, but also desert heat. She could hear the storm, but also radiostatic screaming commands she couldn't follow. Ghost didn't hesitate. He circled in front of her, planted his paws in the snow, and bit down on her left hand. Not hard enough to break skin, hard enough to send a sharp lance of pain through the fog. Pain cut through memory like a blade. Jess gasped. The desert dissolved. Montana crashed back, the boy in her arms, alive, shaking, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm here," Jess whispered. "I'm here." She shifted Luke's weight, took one step, then another, and did not stop again until the arch appeared, and she carried the boy inside to warmth and the sound of people weeping with relief. 5 days passed, 5 days of holding the line between hope and fear inside the steel shell that Jessamine Calder had built with bleeding hands on a ridge nobody believed in. The arch became a world unto itself. Jess organized it with military precision. Food station near the cabin. Sleeping area lined with pallets raised off the cold ground. Injury corner where Doc Tierney treated frostbite and splintered broken bones. Warmth zones near the towering firewood stacks. And at the entrance, Ghost's domain. The dog stationed himself like a sentry watching the storm with patient, unwavering attention. Children played quietly near the wood piles. Ghost let them climb on him, tug his ears, bury their hands in his fur. When a child cried, he would lie beside them and rest his chin on their lap until the crying stopped. Mrs. Laramie baked biscuits on a makeshift skillet. Luke Jenkins taught the younger children card tricks once his leg was bandaged. Truett told old stories about how Ridgeline Valley was first settled, giving frightened families something familiar to hold on to. For the first time in years, Jess found herself needed. Not feared, not avoided, needed. On the fourth night, the storm paused. Not ended, paused, as if drawing breath. The silence woke everyone. Jess stepped outside and stood beneath the arch, looking up at stars that appeared for the first time in days. Bowen found her there. He sat down on a crate without asking permission. Ghost lifted his head, assessed Bowen, and settled back down. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Bowen's voice came, low, rough, stripped of every ounce of bluster. "Curtis isn't dead." Jess turned to look at him. "He's in Wyoming, living out of his truck somewhere near Sheridan. He calls our mother once a year on Christmas, never calls me." Bowen stared at his hands. "After the fire, after he nearly killed Birdie. I told him to leave, told him he was dangerous, told him he'd destroy everything he touched if he stayed." His voice cracked. "I said the same things to you that I said to him. The exact same words. Unstable, unpredictable, dangerous." He pressed his palms against his eyes. "I wasn't trying to protect the valley from you, Jess. I was trying to protect myself from remembering that I failed him." Jess sat with the weight of his words. The wind moved gently through the arch ribs, humming a low, steady note. "Ghost saves me every day," she said quietly. "Every single day. when the noise gets too loud, when the memories come back. When I can't tell what's real and what's the desert, he brings me back. She looked at Bowen. Curtis didn't have a ghost. A sound came out of Bowen that was not quite a sob and not quite a breath. Something older than both. Something that had been locked inside his chest for 5 years, pressing against his ribs the way snow presses against a roof until the roof gives way. He cried, quietly, without shame, for the first time since his brother disappeared. Ghost rose from his post, walked to Bowen, and laid his head on the man's knee. Bowen placed a shaking hand on the dog's scarred fur and left it there until the trembling stopped. On the sixth morning, the storm surrendered. Its roar faded to a whisper, then to silence, a thick, unnatural silence that hung over Iron Ridge like a held breath. Jess stepped outside into the pale dawn. The valley below lay buried. Rooftops collapsed into shapeless lumps. The supply barn was a blackened ruin. The school had split in half. The church steeple was gone. But 27 people stood alive and warm inside a steel shell that had not lost a single bolt. When the state's emergency crews arrived 3 days later, they found every person healthy, fed, treated, organized. The rescue commander stared at the arch for a long time. What the hell is this thing? Jess shrugged. Just engineering. But it was more than engineering. It was a woman who refused to quit, a dog who refused to leave, and a design born from the worst memories of a war that had tried to destroy them both. The valley rebuilt slowly through spring and summer. Homes rose from the snow. Roads were cleared. Lives resumed their ordinary shapes. But something had changed in Ridgeline Valley that could not be unchanged. One afternoon, Bowen climbed the ridge with his hat in his hand. Jess, I want to build a shelter like yours for my family. I want them safe. Jess studied him. Then she nodded. I'll teach you. And me. Harlan said, appearing behind Bowen with a bag of tools. Us too, called Luke Jenkins, limping up the trail on his healing knee. Soon, Jess found herself drawing diagrams on scrap plywood, handing out measuring tapes, teaching people how to bend steel and read wind patterns and anchor foundations into rock. They listened to her, really listened, not with the skeptical patience people reserve for the broken, but with the genuine attention of people who had watched her save their lives and wanted to understand how. For the first time, teaching felt like purpose instead of orders. Ghost adjusted easily to the new rhythm. He wandered from worker to worker, inspecting their tools lying at their feet during breaks. Children followed him everywhere. Within a year, 12 new art shelters stood tall across the valley. Some smaller than Jess's, some larger, all built under her guidance. The state recognized them officially as Colder Art Shelters. Jess winced at the name, but the valley insisted. Seasons passed, years accumulated. Jess's hair silvered, her step slowed. But the cabin stayed warm, and the community she had saved stayed close. And then on a crisp autumn morning, when the aspens had turned to gold and the first frost painted the ridge in white, Jess woke to a silence that was different from every other silence she had known. Ghost did not come to greet her. She found him lying beside the cabin door, curled in his usual spot. The spot where he stationed himself every night to watch over her while she slept. Morning sunlight fell across his fur, more silver now than brown, painting him in soft gold. Jess knelt beside him and placed her hand on his back. He didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't thump his tail. He was warm. He was peaceful. He had gone in his sleep the way soldiers rarely get to go, quietly, without pain, without fear, on his own terms at his own post, guarding the person he had spent his entire life protecting. Jess bowed her head and let the grief move through her. It came not as a storm, but as a river, slow, deep, and vast, filling every space inside her chest that Ghost had kept warm for so many years. He had dragged her from rubble in Afghanistan. He had walked beside her through airports and waiting rooms and the long dirt road to Iron Ridge. He had sat with her through nightmares and flashbacks and moments when the world tilted sideways and threatened to throw her off completely. He had watched, he had guarded, he had loved, with the kind of love that asks nothing and gives everything and never once looks away. Jess sat beside him for an hour. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say that he did not already know. The valley gathered that afternoon. Every family who had survived the storm climbed Iron Ridge. Bowen came first, hat in hand, eyes red. Harlan followed carrying a wooden marker he had carved himself. Doc Tierney, the Henrys. Luke Jenkins walking without a limp now. Nora and Birdie, the girl whose frozen fingers Ghost had warmed with his own body on the darkest night. They buried Ghost at the entrance of the arch, the exact spot where he had stood guard over 27 lives, where the wind split around the steel shell and the ground stayed dry and the world inside remained safe. The marker was simple. 3 lines burned carefully into the grain of mountain pine. Ghost. He stood watch, a true soldier. When Jess stepped back from the grave, the wind moved softly through the ribs of the arch. Not cruel this time, not taunting, not the howling, merciless wind that had tested her from the first day she set foot on this ridge. Almost gentle, like a salute. Harlan rested a hand on Jess's shoulder. Your dog saved this whole valley. Jess nodded, her eyes misting. He saved me first. The years that followed carried the valley into a new era. The arch shelters spread beyond ridgeline, across the county, across the state. Ranchers and miners and mountain families built their own versions. Engineers studied the design. The state offered contracts. Jess declined them all. She didn't want wealth. She didn't want recognition. She wanted every vulnerable family in every storm-prone valley to have a fighting chance. She wanted Ghost's legacy built into steel. Jessamine Calder grew old inside the arch she had raised with her own bleeding hands. Her hair went white. Her body slowed. But the cabin stayed warm and the ridge